There are very few features in a song that are more important than chords. And when it comes to playing the piano, if you really understand how chords work, then you can not only pretty much play any song that you want, but you can also understand how music has been written, you can write your own music, and you can do things like making things up on the spot and improvising. So in this video, I'm going to break down 4 levels of playing chord patterns on the piano. A beginner level, an intermediate level, an advanced level, and a pro level. For each level, I'm going to give you a new concept. I'm going to show you how you can use that concept with songs. I'm going to give you patterns to expand upon that concept. And I'm also going to give you a series of chord progressions that you can use to practice. I'm also going to leave a link in the description to download the notes that I wrote to make this video for free. So firstly, before we get to the beginner level, let's talk about how we actually make chords and what a chord actually is. So in music, a chord is essentially when you play more than 2 notes at the same time. And in music, all chords, no matter how complicated and complex that chord is, are all based on something called a triad. Now, a triad is a 3-note chord, and this is the first thing that we want to be able to understand. But in order to understand triads, first we need to take a few steps back. So in Western music, we actually only use 12 different notes, and on the piano, that is 7 white notes and 5 black notes. Each of the 7 white notes that we have are named after letters of the alphabet. So we have an A, a B, a C, a D, an E, an F, and a G. Once we get to G, the next note is actually another A, so we can just keep repeating those same 7 notes over and over again all over the piano. In between those white notes, we have black notes, and these black notes are something called sharps and flats. Now, the word sharp just means 1 key up. So if I play an A, and I want to find an A sharp, this will be the black key, 1 key to the right of an A. The word flat just means 1 key down. So if I play an A and I want to find an A flat, I will be playing 1 key down from an A. This means that each of the black keys actually has 2 different names. It's got a sharp name and it's also got a flat name. So an F sharp is also a G flat because it's 1 above an F, but it's also 1 below a G. And because the word sharp just means 1 up and the word flat just means 1 down, we can actually refer to some of the white keys as sharps and flats as well. And this is because there are places on the piano where there is no black key between the white keys. So if I play an E, for example, 1 key above an E is an F. So we can also call this an E sharp because it's 1 key above an E, and sharp just means 1 key up. So if I play an F and I play 1 key below an F, this can be called an F flat as well as an E. So with that information, we now have names for every key on the piano. Now, when we are playing any piece of music, we actually don't use all 12 of the keys that we have available to us. We generally only use 7 of the 12 notes, and this is because we want to play 1 version of each of the letters of the alphabet. So in a piece of music, we may see an A, we may see an A sharp, and we may see an A flat, but we will only ever see 1 of these types of A. So we'll see a type of A, a type of B, a type of C, a type of D, a type of E, a type of F, and a type of G, which gives us 7 different notes. And the way that we know which 7 notes to play and which sharps and flats to play is by using something called a scale. And the easiest scale to learn, and the one that most people start with when they are learning the piano, is the scale of C major. And this is because this is the scale that only uses the white notes. It only uses the normal letters. So the scale of C major is the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Now, another example of a scale is the scale of G major, and this uses an F sharp instead of an F, which means the scale of G major has the notes G, A, B, C, D, E, and then an F sharp instead of an F, before getting back to another G to start the scale again. And we can use scales to work out which chords a song is going to be using. And this is because we can make triads using the notes in the scale. And we do this by playing every other note in the scale. For example, if we use the scale of C major, which is just all of the white notes, if I want to make a triad starting on the note C, I can play a C, skip a note, play an E, skip a note, and then play a G, and this will give me a C triad. And in the scale of C major, a C triad is chord number 1 because it starts on note number 1 of the scale. This means that because there are 7 notes in the scale, there are also 7 triads in the scale because we can play a triad starting on each of the notes in the scale. So this is how we form triads. First, we need to understand the scale that we're going to be using, and then we can make triads by playing every other note in the scale starting on any of the notes in the scale. And this takes us onto the beginner level of playing chord patterns. So for this, the concepts that we're going to be working with is playing triads in the right hand and a bass note in the left hand. Now, when we play bass notes in the left hand, all we really want to do is play the name of the chord. So if we play a C triad, we want to play a C in the left hand. And if we play an F triad, we want to play an F in the left hand. The reason that we do this is because when we play the piano, we actually want to try and replicate what a song would normally do. And in normal songs, you usually have a bass part, you have some other instruments filling out the chord notes, you have a melody, and you have some kind of rhythm. So on the piano, we can easily start to replicate this by playing a bass note with the chord. So using the scale of C major, I'm going to use this chord progression, which is the chords 1, chord 4, chord 2, and then chord 5. And I'm going to play it with a triad in the right hand and a bass note in the left hand. So chord 1 using a C major scale is based on note 1 in the scale, and that's a C chord. Chord 4 is based on note 4 in the scale, which is an F chord. Chord 2 is based on note 2 of the scale, which is a D chord. And chord 5 is based on note 5 of the scale, which is a G chord. So if I add a bass note along with each of those chords, then that gives us our first concept. Okay, so how do we take this concept and use patterns in order to make it more interesting? Well, the first thing that we can do is arpeggiate the chords. And arpeggiate just means to separate the notes in the chord. So instead of playing a C major chord like this, I could play it like this. This will be a way of arpeggiating the chord. And there are a few different patterns that we can use, and that are quite common. And the first of these is a pattern called the Alberti bass. And this is essentially where you play the first note in the chord, the last note in the chord, the middle note in the chord, and then the last note in the chord one more time. Now, if I use the chord sequence 1, 4, 2, 5 again, using this pattern might sound like this. Another pattern that we can use is a pattern that separates the notes by playing the first note, the middle note, the last note, the middle note. And this is the pattern that is used in Adele's song, Someone Like You. Another right-hand arpeggio pattern that we can use is playing the top 2 notes of the chord together, followed by the first note in the chord. This pattern is also used in lots of songs, and the first song that comes to mind is the song Imagine by John Lennon. So if I take my chord progression of chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, and chord 5 using a scale of C major, I would get this. So that's a handful of ways that you can make that chord in the right hand sound more interesting by arpeggiating the notes. But to be honest, you can play the 3 notes in whatever order and whatever combination you like the sound of. So that takes care of the right hand, but is there any way that we can actually make the left hand sound more interesting? Well, there's a few things we can do, and the first one is that we can play 2 of the same notes. So if we are playing a C with a C chord, we can actually play 2 Cs in the left hand, and this is called an octave. In music, an octave just means from one note to the next note with the same name, and it's called an octave because oct means 8, and those notes are actually 8 notes apart in the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Playing octaves in the left hand is a really good way of thickening up the texture and making it sound a little bit bigger. So adding octaves might sound like this. As an alternative to adding octaves, we can add something called fifths in the left hand, which is another way of filling out that texture. And a fifth is where we essentially play the outer two notes of the triad in the left hand. So for a C triad, we actually have the notes C, E, and G. So we can play a C and a G in the left hand. And this is called a fifth because it's 5 notes apart in the scale. So if I use fifths in the left hand instead of octaves, it might sound like this. One final thing we can do at the beginner level in order to thicken up the texture is adding an extra note to this triad in the right hand. Now, if we play a C triad, we have the notes C, E, and G. But we can add an octave on top of this as well, which would give us the notes C, E, G with another C at the top. If we played chord 4, which would be an F chord, then we will put an F at the top as well. If we played chord 5, which is a G chord, then we'll play a G at the top as well. So if I was to play my chord progression now with that extra note in the right hand and with octaves in the left hand, it would sound like this. Which gives the music a much thicker texture. Now, as well as arpeggiating the notes in the right hand, we can also arpeggiate the notes across the hands. So we can play whatever we're playing in the left hand, followed by whatever we're playing in the right hand. And this is a really common thing to do. So in the left hand, if we play an octave, and we also play a fifth in the middle of that octave, and in the right hand, we play the triad, we could play this all together like this. But we can also arpeggiate across the hands, which means we can arpeggiate the left hand, followed by the right hand. And if I was to play the chord sequence using this pattern, then I might get something like this. We also have the option here of adding that octave note back in the right hand and arpeggiating it with that note as well. Now for these examples, I've used the scale of C major, which has no sharps and flats, and I used the chord progression chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, and chord 5. However, the reason that it's best to talk about chords using chord numbers, like chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, chord 5, is because then we can take that chord progression and apply it to any scale that we want. For example, if I take this chord progression and want to play it in a G major scale instead, a G major scale has an F sharp instead of an F, so that scale has the notes G, A, B, C, D, E, and then an F sharp instead of an F. So chord 1 using this scale are the notes G, B, and D. Chord 4 using this scale is the notes C, E, and G. Chord 2 in this scale is the notes A, C, and E, and chord 5 in this scale is the notes D, F sharp, and A, because we have an F sharp instead of an F. So I can use all of these patterns playing this chord sequence, chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, chord 5 in C major. Or I could take these 4 chords, chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, and chord 5, and play it in G major instead. Another scale that we can try is the scale of F major, and this has a B flat instead of a B. Now, a B flat is one down from B, which means the notes in an F major scale are F, G, A, B flat, C, D, and E. So chord 1 in this scale is an F chord. Chord 4 in this scale is a B flat chord, which is B flat, D, and F. Chord 2 in this scale is a G chord, which is G, B flat, and D, and chord 5 in this scale is a C chord, which is C, E, and G. So using these patterns, I might get something like this. Because this is the same chord progression, we're just using different scales to play it. they all kind of sound the same and like they have the same quality of sound. And that's because the chords relate to each other in exactly the same way. And here are some chord progressions that you can try and work out for yourself on the piano. Once you've worked out what the notes are in each of the chords, then play around with arpeggiating the notes in the right hand, adding octaves or fifths in the left hand, and arpeggiating the notes across the hands. Okay, on to the intermediate level, and here the concept that we're going to add is the concept of inversions. Now, in music, when we talk about inversions, what we're really talking about is the order in which we play the notes in the chord. If we are using a C major scale again, which is the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and we want to play chord 1 in that scale, which is a C chord, we can play these notes in this order, which is C, E, and G. However, we can reorder these notes and still be playing a C major chord. For example, we can take the C off the bottom and put it on the top instead, which would give us the order E, G, and C. Now, this is exactly the same 3 notes. It's still a C, an E, and a G, and therefore it's still a C triad. However, now we've inverted it, and we actually call this first inversion. We can do the same thing again to this chord and take the E off the bottom and play that on top. And this is still the notes C, E, and G, so it's still a C major chord, and this is called second inversion. If we did the exact same thing again and took the G off the bottom and put that on top, we would actually get to the same order of notes that we had at the start, which is just a normal C triad in root position. Now, the reason that we use inversions is because on the piano we want to try and move as little as possible. When we play chords, we can think of each of the 3 notes that we're playing as a voice. And if we were singing one of these 3 notes and then moving to a different chord, we would be jumping around quite a lot. And by rearranging the notes in the chord, we can find inversions that are much closer together. For example, if I play chord 1, which is a C chord, C, E, and G, and I want to go to chord 4, which is an F chord, F, A, and C, I have to jump my whole hand up 4 notes. However, because the notes in an F chord are the notes F, A, and C, I can rearrange these notes so that I can find an F, an A, and a C much closer to that C chord. So my C chord is C, E, and G, and if I actually just move these top 2 notes up 1, I get C, F, and A, which is an F major chord because it's still the notes F, A, and C, it's just in a different order. So the concept here is to try and play a chord progression moving your right hand as little as possible. And to do this, once again, I will show you using C major, and I'll use the chord progression chord 1, 4, 6, 5. So chord 1 in C major is a C chord, chord 4 is an F chord, chord 6 is an A chord, and chord 5 is a G chord. So to get from a C chord to an F chord, I play the notes C, E, and G, and I want to find the notes F, A, and C as close as possible to that C chord. And I can find that by moving the top 2 notes up 1 to get C, F, and A. Now from here, I want to get to an A chord. The notes in an A chord were A, C, and E. So if I'm going from here, I'm actually already playing a C and an A. So I just need to find an E. And we can swap this F for an E in the middle. And that still gives us an A chord. From here, I want to try and get to chord 5, which is a G chord. And that's the notes G, B, and D. So from here, I can just move all of my fingers down 1 note to get to B, D, G, which is also a G chord because it's the same 3 notes. So this would give me this. And like the level before, I can add octaves or fifths to that left hand if I want to. I can also arpeggiate this right hand in exactly the same way as we did before. So instead of playing a normal C chord, I could play this pattern. I could play this pattern. I could play this pattern. And I can do the same for each of the inversions. So if I add those octaves back into the left hand and I add some patterns back into the right hand, but this time using inversions instead, I might get something like this. When we talk about inversions in music, all we're really referring to is which note is at the bottom of the chord. So if the name of the chord is at the bottom, so if a C is at the bottom of a C chord, then we call this root position. If the middle note is at the bottom of the chord, then this is first inversion, and in this case that's an E. And if the top note is at the bottom of the chord, in this case that's a G, then this is second inversion. This means that not only can we play inversions in the right hand, but we can actually change the inversion of the entire chord by changing what the bottom note is that we're playing. And that note is actually in the left hand. So for example, if I play a C chord, I could play a C in the left hand, and this would give me a C chord with the root note in the left hand, therefore making the entire chord a root position chord. But I could play an E in the left hand, which is the middle note of the chord, and that would make a first inversion C triad. And I could play a G in the left hand, which would make a second inversion C triad. And there are a few reasons that you might want to do this. The main one being that each of these notes that you play in the left hand has a very different quality of sound. If you play the root note in the bass, the chord sounds very stable and strong. If you play the middle note in the bass, the chord sounds a bit more weak and longing. And if you play the top note in the bass, then the chord sounds stable and strong, but it's still a little bit weaker than if we had the root note in the bass. And you can play around with this and use this to your advantage with a chord progression. So if I go back to my chord progression of chord 1, chord 5, chord 2, and then chord 4, as well as inverting the right hand, I may choose to invert some of the notes in the left hand as well to change the quality of the chord. For example, I might start with the C major chord and playing a C in the left hand. However, when I play a G chord, which is chord 5, I might play the middle note in the left hand. And then for chord 2, which is a D chord, I might play the top note in the left hand. And then for chord 4, which is an F chord, I might play the root note again. So if I invert both hands, I might get something like this. And if I layer patterns on top of that, I might get something like this. Once again, you can take these same chord progressions and move them into different scales and try and work out the chords that will be used in that particular scale. And here are some chord progressions that you can try and work out which inversions require as little movement as possible in the right hand, and which bass notes from those chords you like the sound of in the left hand. So that takes us onto the third level, which is the advanced level. And for this level, we want to start thinking about chords as a set of notes rather than a hand shape and a hand position that we're playing on the piano. We've already started doing this a little bit with inversions, because in order to work out inversions, you have to think about what notes are in the chord and then move them around. However, now for a C major chord, instead of thinking about this shape, we want to start thinking of a C major chord as the notes C, E, and G. This allows us to do two things. First of all, it allows us to move a little bit more freely around the piano, because as long as we're playing C's, E's, and G's, then we're going to be playing a C major chord. But it also allows us the freedom to think about what quality of sound do we really want to be playing on the piano. If I wanted to play a C here, an E here, and a G here, this is still a C major chord. It's just spread out much more on the piano. And this way of playing C major has a very unique sound. It sounds much warmer. In the same way that if I play a C, a G, and an E here, it sounds a little bit more sparse. And there are certain patterns that we can use that have a very particular type of sound that you might want to use. So firstly, in the right hand, we have the idea of playing arpeggios. Now, we've already used arpeggiation in the beginner level when we took the normal triad and separated out the notes, because arpeggiation just means separating out the notes. However, now we can start using arpeggios to move around on the piano. So for a C triad, because it's the notes C, E, and G, I can play C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C. And this would be a way of using arpeggios to move around the piano. Another way that we can use arpeggios to start moving around the piano is by using something called broken chords. Now, a broken chord is simply where we take the chord and break it into its individual notes, like this. However, for broken chords, what we actually do is we arpeggiate the notes like this, but we play through each of the inversions breaking the chord. So we might go C, E, G, and then E, G, C, and then G, C, E, and then C, E, G, E, G, C, G, C, E, and so on up the piano. So we can think of a broken chord as an arpeggio that goes through each of the inversions of a chord. And this is another way of making our right hand sound a little bit more interesting and allowing us to move around on the piano. So those are some ways that we can move around in the right hand, but we can actually also arpeggiate the left hand and move around. So far in the left hand, we've played octaves and we've played fifths, either in the middle of that octave or just fifths on their own. But now, in order to move around in the left hand, we can play these notes separately, and we can also reintroduce that note that's missing from the full chord. So in the left hand, we can play the fifth and the octave separately, and then we can put our third finger over to continue playing the notes from that triad. This way, in the left hand, we can also travel around the piano much more freely because we can go up as high as we want, and we can also come back down. That gives us several ways in the right hand and the left hand to be able to move around the piano. But because we're now thinking about the chord as individual notes, we can play the chords in lots of different ways in order to provide us different qualities of sound. And one of my personal favourite ways of playing chords is by using something called tenths. Now, in the same way that a fifth is 5 notes apart in the scale and an octave is 8 notes apart in the scale, a tenth is 10 notes apart in the scale. So if the chord we're trying to play is a C triad and we're using a C major scale, note 1 in this chord is a C, and then we can count through the scale to get to note number 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And this gives us an E. Now, an E is actually the middle note in a C triad, so all we're really doing is getting rid of the top note and moving this note up an octave. Playing the chord in this way makes the chord sound really warm. And once again, if we want to thicken that texture up a little bit, we can add the missing note back as a fifth in the left hand. So using the chord progression chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, and chord 5 would sound like this. We now also have the flexibility in the right hand to jump around a little bit, so we can play the same chord in lots of different places, or we could play inversions of the chord. And we can also do the same in the left hand, so we could play an octave C, followed by a C chord. And then for chord 4, we could play an octave F, followed by an F chord. And then for chord 2, an octave D, followed by a D chord. And chord 5, an octave G, followed by a G chord. This now gives us almost endless options of things that we can do on the piano, because we can move up and down the piano using arpeggios or broken chords in either hand. We can play chords in lots of different places on the piano, and this is all just because we're now thinking of each of the chords as its component notes, rather than as a shape on the piano. And here are some chord progressions for you to try. Firstly, try and work out what each of the triads are in the scale, and then try and play around with arpeggiating those triads across the piano in both the right hand and the left hand. And also try spreading those notes out in different ways, such as playing tenths. So that takes us on to the 4th level, which is the pro level. And for this level, the concept is to add notes to chords in order to make them sound more interesting or add different qualities of sound. Now, in my opinion, adding notes to triads is better done by experimenting. So if we play a C triad and I want to add any note to this triad, I should do that by just adding notes to the triad and seeing what I like the sound of. So I might add an F, I might add a D, I might add an A, I might add a B. There really is no rules about how you should play, and it's much better to experiment and find something that you like, and then work out what the name of the thing is that you did in order to be able to repeat it in future. But there are several ways of adding notes to chords that people generally find interesting, and the first one of these is adding sevenths to your chords. Now, when we play a triad using a scale, we are playing note 1, 3, and 5 in the scale, from whichever note in the scale you decide to start your chord on, and a seventh is just adding the note 7 to this, so we actually play another alternating note on top of the 3 that we already have. This means that we can do this with, once again, all 7 chords in the scale. So we could have chord 1 with a 7 on it, chord 2 with a 7 on it, chord 3 with a 7 on it, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Adding sevenths to chords tends to add a little bit more of a jazzy tone to it, and they're a really good way of making things sound a little bit more nuanced and interesting. So if I use the chord progression chord 1, chord 4, chord 2, and chord 5, and I add sevenths to each of these chords, I might get something like this. And similarly, like in the intermediate level, we can invert these chords so that we don't have to move as much. Now, this can be a little bit more challenging to think about if you haven't practiced these a lot, because there are 4 notes to think about rather than just 3. So the way that I think is easiest to think about this is invert your triads and then add the extra note afterwards. So if I have a C chord, chord 1, going to chord 4, which is an F chord, if I invert the F chord so that it's near the C chord, if I want to add the 7th to that F chord, all I have to do is add an E to this, which would give me a C chord followed by an F major 7 chord in its inversion. And like our advanced level, we can play arpeggios of these 7th chords as well. And we can also spread these chords out. So we can play the 10ths that we played before, but we can add 7ths to it as well. Another common way of adding notes to triads is by using something called an add 2 or an add 4. Now, pretty much as it says on the tin, what we are doing is we are adding the 2nd note in the scale or the 4th note in the scale. This gives us a little bit more of a crunchy texture because we have 3 consecutive notes. I always like to think of add 2 and add 4 chords as the types of chords that are used in the computer game The Sims. It's got a very ethereal, happy, in the clouds type of sound to it. Unlike all of the other types of chords, once again, we can arpeggiate them. And we can play them more spread out if we think about the notes that make up the chord, which is a C, a D, an E, and a G if we are playing a C add 2. So we could play a C, a G, an E, and a D. A similar type of chord to this that is often used is something called a sus2 or a sus4. Now, a sus2 and a sus4, the sus part of this stands for suspension. And this is where this note is suspended over the chord. So if I have a C triad, and that's the notes C, E, and G, if I play a sus2, I'm going to replace my E with a D, because that's the 2nd note. Now, this is suspended in the chord and feels like it wants to go back to an E. So that is usually what happens. You would play a C, a D, and a G, going to a C, an E, and a G. And similarly, with a sus4 chord, you would get a C, an F, and a G, going to a C, an E, and a G. These types of chords add a temporary little bit of tension before resolving the chord. A really good example of this is the song Crazy Little Thing Called Love by Queen. The only distinction between an add 2 and a sus2 is that with an add 2 you are adding the note to the chord, and with a sus2 you are replacing the middle note of the chord with the 2 or the 4. And if we want to combine a few of these elements together, we can add 7ths with 2s and 4s, and these are called 9 and 11 chords. So if we play a C chord and we want to add the 7, we get a C major 7 chord. If we add the 9, this gives us a D. Now we can actually play this D here, which would be the same note that we added for our add 2 and our sus2. But we call it a 9 because we also have the 7 in there. So we would call this an 11 rather than a 4. So that would give us the notes C, E, F, G, and B. These chords are a little bit more complicated, and this is why I always think it's best to just play a triad and add whichever notes you like the sound of, and then work out afterwards what chord that was. So if you play a C triad and you think, I want to add a B to this, then afterwards you can think, what chord is that? And you work out that it's actually C, E, G, B, which is a C major 7 chord. And then that way you can remember that type of chord for the next time that you want to use it. But I think it's always best to start from a place of experimentation. And if you want to practice using these types of chords in different scales, here are a set of chord progressions that you can use to do that. And remember, once you get comfortable with these types of chords, you can always arpeggiate the chords in the right hand, arpeggiate them in the left hand, add octaves in the left hand, add fifths in the left hand, play the chords as tenths with added notes on top. You can also invert the chords and invert the note that you play in the left hand, so you're playing a different note from the chord in the left hand. There are literally endless things that you can do in any given progression, and this is why it's so important to just play around with these ideas for yourself. So those are the 4 levels of chord patterns that you can use on the piano. However, I wanted to just mention one last thing, and that is something that I haven't mentioned throughout this entire video, and that is the difference between major chords, minor chords, and other types of chords. And the reason that I haven't mentioned this so far is because it's more important to think about chords as they relate to the scale, and therefore which chord number you're going to be playing, rather than what type of chord it is that you're playing. However, in a normal major scale, the types of chords that you're going to see are going to be the same in every scale. So chord 1 is always going to be a major chord, and major chords tend to have a little bit more of a positive, happier sound to them. Chord 4 and chord 5 will also be major chords. Chord 2, 3, and 6 will be minor chords, and chord 7 will be something called a diminished chord, which sounds a little bit more odd. If you are writing a piece of music, this is another thing that you can use to decide which chords you want to use. So for example, if I am using the scale of G major, that's the notes G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp instead of F before we get back to another G. Chord 1 will be a G major triad. Chord 2 will be an A minor triad. Chord 3 will be a B minor triad. Chord 4 will be a C major triad. Chord 5 will be a D major triad. Chord 6 will be an E minor triad. And chord 7 would be an F sharp diminished triad. As well as understanding chord patterns on the piano and how you actually play chords, it's good to get a fuller understanding of the different types of chords that you're going to come across. And I actually went through the 8 levels of playing chords on the piano in this video here. So if you are interested in that, then head on through and I will see you there.